Okay, this is really exciting. We'll get started with the painting process. Now I'm starting with a very dark flat wash for the background. Now I cut out the mixing, but it took a long time to mix this dark of a value. So I'm digging my brush into the black paint well just to get out the right amount of darkness, which is actually as dark as I can. And I'm working my way around the shoes. This part of the wash is fairly simple because I'm just painting around those smaller details. So around the top of the shoe, around the shoelaces, and some of those details around the other shoe. Just working my way around that. But where it really gets more complex is actually near that line where it switches from dark to light. And I'm going to show you how I tackle it. I think it's a very interesting technique, and I think it's worth mentioning. Now, I cut out some parts of the shoe there accidentally, so I just rolled with the punches, basically just kept painting, disregarding that shape. That's actually fine. Sometimes you'll make a mistake that is seemingly significant, but in the grand scheme of things, ended up not changing anything at all. Just be careful around these tight spots where you really are. Try and be a little more accurate around the important, outlines of the shapes. I'm not touching the shoes themselves at all. I don't care about any of that. Now, in this lesson, what we'll do is basically work our way from this initial stage onto where we put in some basic values for everything. And the next third part of the demo will be the details. Okay, but for now we're just starting to establish this painting. So pulling this wash, and I keep adding more and more dark paint. You see more and more and more, all the way till we get to where it changes from light to dark. Now here's where it's going to be a very important transition. This is the background. I want to keep it in the background. I don't want it to interfere with the impression of the shoes. And I have a lot of hard edges with the shoes. So what am I going to do? I'm going to make sure I get a soft transition there. A soft transition that feels out of focus. That is really important, okay? So here I go. This is where it's sharp, yet. It's still sharp. I'm also using this opportunity just to darken some spots that feel like they've gone a little too light. Sometimes you just don't judge the value correctly. So I'm just putting some wet and wet, super thick paint. This is just pure black, thick paint. This is a White Knights St. Petersburg black paint. It's really good. I believe it's charcoal black, something like that. And now I'm changing to a watery wash. Still not just water. It still has some paint in it, but very little. And look at what I'm doing here. I'm touching the edge with a very wet wash. Again, very wet. Now, an important point here. My paper is at an angle, at about a 15-degree angle downwards. And this is to make sure that this wet paint doesn't go back up into the dark background, because that would create crazy cauliflowers and a big mess. I don't want that. I want everything to move downwards, okay? So I make sure that my paper is at an angle, and then I'm continuing with this value that is kind of a mid to light value, all the way down to the bottom and around the shoe, okay? And trying to get that shape of the edge of the sole. And by doing this, by putting the very dark paint next to a lighter wash, the lighter wash helps the dark paint move downwards and create this beautiful, smooth transition from dark to light. And this was probably the most important stage of this initial kind of a wash. You'll notice I don't cover everything with paint. It's a very different first wash than some of the other paintings you've seen, because there were a lot of scenes earlier, and this is more of like a still life subject. So I'm really tackling it in the different areas I see, rather than filling in everything with paint and then doing wet and wet. And then it's just not as necessary here. We have a dark background and then a lighter object that is the main focal point. And now notice what I did here. I put some dark paint, and once again, I'm putting next to it lighter paint. And that helps move the dark paint into the lighter paint, making a soft transition there. That's actually very important because the shadow under the shoes is also fairly blended. It moves into it has a soft edge. You don't want to create a hard edge there. So I'm really taking care of those shapes. And even if you just now look at the reference photo, look at the background. It's very isolated from the actual shoes in the foreground. It's just that black turns very smoothly into the lighter value that is still darker than the front of the shoe. And that's a key point. If you look at the front of the shoe, the background is still darker than that. The white there is stronger. That's really important. Now moving on to the left side of the sole, I don't want to go with the darkest darks yet. So I'm starting with this, which is kind of a mid to dark value, keeping it very watery, but still relatively dark because it's a smaller wash and I can afford that. I'm not worried about the paint drying because it's a little thicker. And look at all the details within that shadow. I just know I can't put them all at once. So I'm starting with a flat mid-value wash, mid to dark value wash that ends, you see, in the front part of the shoelace. You will see in just a moment. Not shoelace, the sole. Around the shoelaces that are lighter. You see here it ends, this slightly darker value. And it's going to go around that front of the sole. And it's going to gradually go lighter as it gets to the front. So I'm coming back with water. Actually decided to connect it to the bottom part. And I'm going in with lighter paint, especially near the front, just to get it to go lighter there. And look at this beautiful smooth transition from left to right. Coming back with a bit more water, it wasn't light enough. And just making it lighter on the right edge of the shoe. The reason I was a bit worried about making it lighter there is because it still needs to be lighter than the background in some areas, okay? This process is going to be a little messy in that, again, I'm not working from a large wash and then smaller wash, and then I'm actually rendering the different areas I see. So if I see an area with a smooth transition, I'm just going to focus on that, disregarding everything else, like the background, like this bottom of the shoe. You will see me working really in sections here. That's actually a big part of getting a realistic impression in a way, even with simplifying and all of that, because it's like you can't swallow the entire painting at once. You have to work at it in smaller sections, smaller containable sections. So now I'm jumping off to the shoelaces. They have some very gentle shadows on them. And you see, so I'm just rendering these with a pretty light wash, and I'm also trying to imitate that pattern of the fabric. Now, a lot of people make the mistake of filling everything up with that pattern, and this is where your realism gets hurt. You don't want to put this texture on everything. A texture is something that's hinted at. It's not something that is stated. And that's, again, a major issue for many people. How do I convey a texture of fur? How do I convey a grassy texture? You convey it by not spelling it out for the viewer, but rather by hinting at it in some spots, and letting the viewer figure out the rest. And it really is important to keep this rule in a way. So if you look at how I simplify this piece, it's like that. I'm simplifying the textures. I'm not going to sit here and paint each and every small detail and bump on the cloth texture, on the seams. I'm not going to do any of that. I'm going to hint at these textures, okay? And now on to this part of the shoe. It seemed like a part that's going to be easy to tackle with this thin kind of mid-value wash, so I put that there. Going over the laces again, while I have this pretty light value, putting in the texture, that's a little too dark, so I'll probably lift some of that, or I'll just leave it. Going over these just while I have that idea in mind. Now, if you are looking for some logic, like why am I working on the shoelaces, is that I do attempt to work from light to dark. I am trying to preserve that kind of a watercolory process. And by the way, sorry for the temperature changes. The sun came out, and I'm using natural light, so everything went a little yellow there. Sorry about that. But I am trying to go from light to dark, so I'm starting with the shoelaces. I'm starting with the lightest details, and then I'll slowly make my way towards the slightly darker details. Now, for example, the other sole or bottom of the leg is a good place to continue there. Now, look at what I'm doing. I'm only focusing on that. I don't care about the cloth part above it, okay? And I'm going to leave a couple of areas untouched Because look at that part really in the reference photo. It has a few spots that seem to be lighter. So I'm going to leave these gaps. You'll see in just a moment. I'll leave a gap and then I'll continue with this same value. And this gap is going to be very meaningful later on. It's actually really important. And while I have this value, I'm also working on that. I don't know what you'd call this, like the logo or the text. And I'm also leaving a small highlight there. Okay? And this is really key. I'm working on this area by area, small section by small section, but for every small section I work on, I actually devote a lot of attention to. And I make sure that I get those details in correctly, in space correctly. For example, now there are some areas that should be darker, so why not put them while they touch this area to get the smoother transition after, like the bottom of the shoe here. This really made me actually break my pattern of light to dark, because some shapes, it's really hard to explain sometimes, but some shapes feel related to me, so I may go for those first. And I really thought that these two are connected, the sole and the bottom, the actual bottom of the shoe. So I just jumped from one shape to another. Now, while I'm at it, I'm going to make it as dark as it needs to be, which is almost as dark as the background. So I'm putting in those dark values. It may have just a thin sliver of an edge that's slightly lighter at the top part. All of these small control wet in wet kind of technique, it's not easy. It is something that will come with time. Now look at what happens here. The sole casts a shadow on the shoe underneath it. And this is just a poster child for why you connect shapes. This shape, if you look at the reference photo, it is connected. It looks connected. So even though we know it's not the same, it's two different shoes. There, the shadow on the sole up top and the shoe on the bottom, it's not the same physical object. But because they're at such a close proximity to one another, there is no way I'm going to separate them. Because remember, as artists, we make a statement. The statement I want to make here is shadow. It's not, the statement I want to make is not one shoe on top of another shoe with the thin line making a distinction between the two. I don't care about that. I want to show it as a shadow. So the shadow here plays a role as one big unit. And to be honest with you, when I painted that dark bottom part of the sole, I didn't really know for sure if I'll continue it over the shoe underneath. But I decided to do it at the spur of the moment because it makes sense. Okay, it makes sense to have these two areas connected. If I make a very clear separation there, it immediately attracts the viewer's attention to this spot. There's nothing wrong with that per se, but do I want the viewer to focus on that section? Not really. I want the viewer to focus more on maybe the shoelaces and the small details on the tag from the back of the shoe and the strong contrast between the shoelaces and the cloth. I want to really have this focal point of the details of the shoes rather than this random shadow between the shoes, okay? So this is as detailed of an explanation as I can provide for why did I connect the two shapes here. And this is going to be a recurring theme throughout this process of me connecting some shapes where I want to simplify the message for the viewer. Now, if you look at the entire cloth of the shoe here, it is darker, obviously, than the paper white. However, this isn't as dark as it will go. I'm doing this very interesting strategy where I know the actual color of it is darker, the value. I know it's darker for all of this piece of cloth that makes up most of the shoe. So I'm just covering it with a flat wash while avoiding the highlights. So if anything, this is more similar to a first wash, to a more traditional classic first wash in my style. So the first washes you saw so far were basically painting around the highlights. You saw that kind of a motif a lot. This wash represents that kind of a work process, but it is very contained in that singular area of the shoe, which is the entire cloth part, but it's still a very contained area, okay? So the reason why I do that is because there is so much nuance in this area that if I try to paint it a la prima in one go and go here dark, here it's a little lighter, it's going to be very challenging. It's going to be a very challenging wash. So I'm just making my life a little easier by painting it first flat because I see that all of it is darker than the paper white. So why not cover it with a flat wash, give myself the opportunity to have something to work with in the next washes, and then is when I'll create the actual distinction between the darker areas, the different folds and the curves of the cloth, and all of that. And notice how just painting around these highlights of the metal pieces for the laces really brings out a beautiful, beautiful effect. Now this does go a little lighter from left to right, even though it's a flat wash. It does go a little lighter. I kept it flat, but I may just charge some water in it in just a moment, just to make the right section a little lighter, just a little bit. You can look at it as a gradual wash from slightly dark to slightly light. But in case, yeah, the meeting point between the shoes is important. It's something I'll make a better distinction of later on. You see I'm coming back with more water than paint here. It's a very small difference, but you may notice I'm just using a bit more water to expand it to the right. Again, making my way around the highlights. We're almost done with this stage of just establishing a few first values for the painting. And with that, we're done with the left section of the cloth of this shoe. And you see how it's just a step in the way. It's not meant to look good yet. Okay, we have the shoelaces and the very gentle shadows on top of them. We have the bottoms of the shoes. We have the background here. That's how you slowly build it up. Now, I'm doing something very interesting with this shoe. I started with just water, and then I'm putting next to it some paint that is very light. The top was just water, and then it came into, the paint just met the water there. And this is what allowed me to have this gradual transition from slightly light to slightly dark. Okay, now while it's still wet, I'm lifting back. You see, there are just a lot of nuances of shape in this shoe, and they're all kind of blended together. So I want to make sure I get that in one go. Okay, I won't always do that, but in this instance, it looks smart to just get this shoe in as fewer layers as I can. And what you see here is me trying to render that. It's not easy at all, but I'm just going for it. Now, while it's still wet, look at this beautiful shadow in between the top and bottom part. That's something I have to try and get wet in wet. So I'm coming back with very thick paint while the wash on the paper is still very wet. And I put that in. Now, the reason it doesn't move much, and this comes down to the nuances of wet and wet, you have to play around with this technique to really get it. But the reason is I'm using very, very thick paint. The wetter the paper is, the thicker the paint you have to use to negate that wetness, okay? Because the paint is going to meet a very wet page, and it's really important to understand the nuances here. There's a lot that goes into wet and wets. It's something I definitely cover in different videos, different lessons, different courses, but it's a very subtle technique that just requires a lot of training, okay? But what we have here is essentially this shoe is done. We got all the nuances of light and shadow. The transitions work really well, I think. I'm now using the brush a bit cleaned and dried just to make sure that maybe I'll lift some places I kind of messed up, or add a bit of white of dark areas to the different sections that are a little darker. And remember that the paper is drying as we continue. So if I keep coming back with thick paint, it will move less and less. Okay, the more the paper dries. And this is really a great example of that. Put in a small dark spot there too, and now we're done with this stage, and we can move on to the next one.